Two Black Hawk helicopters sliced through the darkness, flying low to avoid Pakistani radar. Inside, 24 Navy SEALs checked their weapons one final time. Their target, a mysterious compound in this quiet Pakistani city, just 35 miles from the capital Islamabad. The compound was unlike anything else in the neighborhood. 12-foot concrete walls topped with barbed wire. No internet connection. No phone lines. Windows deliberately positioned to prevent anyone from seeing inside. A third-floor balcony equipped with a 7-foot privacy screen, tall enough to hide someone who stood 6'4". For nearly a year, the CIA had watched this fortress. Satellite imagery, drone surveillance, agents on the ground. They'd spent tens of millions of dollars monitoring who came and went. Yet, despite America's most sophisticated technology, they'd never obtained a single photograph proving their suspicion. But they were certain. The world's most wanted man was inside. As the helicopters descended toward the compound, President Barack Obama watched grainy live footage from the White House Situation Room 7,000 miles away. The room was silent. Everything hinged on the next few minutes. One helicopter landed successfully in the compound courtyard. The other clipped the perimeter wall during descent and crashed, rotor blades screaming against concrete. But the SEALs were already moving. Within seconds, gunfire erupted. The operators moved through the compound with lethal efficiency, clearing rooms, neutralizing resistance. On the second floor, they encountered and killed one of the target's adult sons. On the third floor, they found him, standing in the doorway of his bedroom, a tall, bearded figure in the darkness. At 12:39 a.m. local time, SEAL Team 6 achieved their objective. The architect of the September 11th attacks, the man who had murdered nearly 3,000 people and changed the course of history, lay dead on the floor of his bedroom. Sewn into his clothing, 500 euros and 2 telephone numbers, his escape plan if this moment ever came. It was an inglorious end for a man who had spent 2 decades declaring holy war against the world's most powerful nation. But how had it come to this? How does the privileged son of a billionaire construction magnate become the world's most notorious terrorist? The answer begins 54 years earlier, in the desert kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The man history would know as Osama bin Laden entered the world on March 10, 1957. For years, international intelligence agencies believed he was born in Jeddah, the cosmopolitan port city on Saudi Arabia's Red Sea coast. The truth, now generally accepted, was more prosaic. He was born in Riyadh, the conservative desert capital where his father had built an empire. His father, Mohammed bin Awad bin Laden, represented one of 20th century Arabia's great success stories. Born in Yemen in 1908 into modest circumstances, Mohammed had arrived in Saudi Arabia as a young man with nothing but ambition. His timing proved impeccable. In the 1930s, as Abdulaziz ibn Saud consolidated control over the Arabian Peninsula and proclaimed the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed had established himself as a construction contractor of remarkable skill and even more remarkable political acumen. The relationship Mohammed cultivated with the Saudi royal family would prove transformative. His company, the Saudi bin Laden Group, secured increasingly lucrative contracts, roads, government buildings, eventually the most sacred projects imaginable. By the 1950s, Mohammed bin Laden had been entrusted with the ongoing maintenance and renovation of the mosques in Mecca and Medina, Islam's 2 holiest sites. For a construction contractor, this was the equivalent of being appointed guardian of Christianity's most sacred spaces. The trust implied was absolute. The wealth that followed was staggering, but Mohammed's personal life was complicated. Islamic law permits a man up to 4 wives simultaneously, though Mohammed practiced serial polygamy on an extraordinary scale, marrying and divorcing numerous times throughout his life. By some counts, he married more than 20 women, though never more than 4 at any given time. Hamida al-Attas was different from Mohammed's other wives. She was Syrian, from a prosperous family of citrus farmers near the coastal city of Latakia. She was also shockingly young, just 14 years old, when she married the 48-year-old millionaire in 1956. Some historians question whether they formally married at all, suggesting she may have been merely a concubine, a practice not uncommon among wealthy men of that era. A year later, she bore him a son. They named him Osama, meaning lion in Arabic. The marriage, if it was one, collapsed almost immediately after the child's birth. Mohammed divorced Hamida when Osama was barely a year old. The reasons remain murky, perhaps the age difference, perhaps Mohammed's restless nature, perhaps something else entirely. Hamida soon remarried, this time to Mohammed Al-Attas, a business associate of her former husband. Al-Attas was Syrian like Hamida, and their marriage proved stable. Together they had 4 children, 3 sons and a daughter who would become Osama's half-siblings. Young Osama was sent to live with his mother and stepfather. He grew up in their household in Jeddah, the cosmopolitan port city, where foreign influences mingled more freely than in conservative Riyadh. The arrangement might suggest abandonment, but this would misread the situation. Mohammed bin Laden maintained regular contact with all his children from various marriages, estimated at more than 50 in total. Osama visited his father frequently and received the same religious education Mohammed insisted upon for all his sons. For despite his wealth and Western business connections, Mohammed bin Laden was deeply conservative in matters of faith. He belonged to the Wahhabi tradition, a puritanical interpretation of Sunni Islam that had emerged in 18th century Arabia and become the dominant religious current in Saudi Arabia. Muhammad insisted his sons memorize the Quran, understand Islamic law, and maintain strict religious observance. The contradiction, embracing Western capitalism while rejecting Western culture, would profoundly shape Osama's worldview. Yet, Osama's childhood wasn't defined solely by religious instruction and absent fathers. By all accounts, he experienced a relatively normal boyhood, at least by the standards of extraordinarily wealthy Saudi families. He attended the Al-Thaga Model School in Jeddah, an elite institution that educated the sons of Saudi Arabia's upper class. He played football, soccer, as Americans call it, and followed England's Arsenal club with the enthusiasm typical of teenage boys worldwide. He showed interest in military history, devouring books about famous battles and great commanders. In 1971, at age 14, Osama had his first significant exposure to the West. Mohammed sent him to Oxford University in Britain for an English language course. The experience was meant to provide linguistic skills useful for international business. What impression it made on the teenage boy is unclear. Did he see the West as alluring or decadent? The historical record provides no answer. We know only that he returned to Saudi Arabia afterward and continued his education. Then came the event that would cast a long shadow over Osama's life. In 1967, Mohammed bin Laden died in a plane crash. The accident was mundane. The pilot misjudged a landing in Saudi Arabia, but its impact on the family was profound. Mohammed was only 59 years old, still vigorous, still building. His death meant Osama, at just 10 years old, would grow up without his father's direct influence. Though Mohammed's conservative religious teachings had already taken root, the Saudi bin Laden group didn't falter. Mohammed's older sons from earlier marriages assumed control and proved capable stewards. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, the company diversified and expanded, its value eventually reaching into the billions. Major construction projects across the Middle East bore the bin Laden name. The family's wealth seemed inexhaustible. Osama stood to inherit approximately $30 million from his father's estate, equivalent to perhaps $100 million in today's currency. He would never need to work. His future seemed secure: join the family business, make money, live comfortably, perhaps pursue philanthropic works. For the son of one of Arabia's wealthiest dynasties, the path forward seemed clear and comfortable. But Osama bin Laden would choose a very different path. At age 17, In 1974, Osama married for the first time. His bride, Najwa Ghanem, was also Syrian, his first cousin on his mother's side. The marriage had been arranged by their families in the traditional manner. Najwa was a year older than Osama, and by all accounts, she was his favorite among the multiple wives he would eventually take. Their early years together coincided with Osama's university education. In 1976, at 19, he enrolled at King Abdulaziz University in Jeddah, ostensibly to study economics and business administration. The choice made sense for someone expected to join the family construction empire. The reality proved more complicated. Those who knew bin Laden during his university years remembered a young man increasingly consumed by subjects that had nothing to do with business. His primary interests, they reported, centered on religion, poetry, and Arabic literature. He attended lectures on Islamic theology with an intensity that struck his peers as unusual, even at a deeply religious university in one of the world's most conservative Muslim countries. King Abdulaziz University in the late 1970s was an intellectual hotbed of pan-Islamist thought. Pan-Islamism, the ideology advocating unity among all Muslims regardless of nationality, had been gaining momentum across the Middle East for decades. Its adherents argued that the Muslim world's weakness resulted from division. Only by uniting under a single Islamic identity could Muslims restore the glory of the medieval caliphate that had once ruled from Baghdad and stretched from Spain to India. Central to this ideology was a deep suspicion of Western influence. The British and French had carved up the Middle East after World War I, drawing arbitrary borders and installing puppet rulers. The United States, while anti-colonial in rhetoric, had emerged as the region's dominant foreign power, propping up monarchies and dictators who served American oil interests. And then there was Israel, established in 1948 on land Palestinians considered theirs, backed militarily and financially by the United States, repeatedly defeating Arab armies in wars that humiliated the Muslim world. At Abdulaziz University, Osama encountered the ideas of Sayyid Qutb, an Egyptian Islamic theorist whose writings had electrified and radicalized a generation of young Muslims. Qutb had been executed by Egypt's secular government in 1966, making him a martyr. His books, still widely distributed despite, or perhaps because of, being banned in many Arab countries, argued that modern Muslim states had fallen into Jahiliyyah, a state of ignorance similar to pre-Islamic Arabia. True Muslims, Qutb wrote, had an obligation to wage jihad against these corrupt regimes and against the Western powers supporting them. Jihad, the word means struggle in Arabic and can refer to internal, spiritual struggle or external holy war. Qutb advocated the latter. His writings contained explicit calls for violence in service of re-establishing an Islamic caliphate governed by Sharia law, a legal system based on literal interpretation of the Quran and the Hadith. The recorded sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, Qutb's anti-Western sentiment was visceral. He'd spent time in America in the late 1940s and returned home disgusted by what he perceived as materialism, sexual promiscuity, and spiritual emptiness. America, he wrote, was a civilization built on satisfying base desires rather than elevating the soul. It corrupted everything it touched. Muslims who embraced Western values betrayed Islam itself. Significantly, Qutb's younger brother Muhammad taught at Abdulaziz University, while Osama was a student there. Muhammad Qutb had made promoting his martyred brother's ideas his life's mission. Whether Osama studied directly under Muhammad Qutb remains unclear, but he certainly encountered the man's teachings. The influence was profound and lasting. Another figure entered Osama's life during this period, Abdullah Azzam, a Palestinian Islamic scholar and militant who lectured at Abdulaziz. Azzam would later become known as the father of global jihad, and his mentorship of bin Laden would help shape modern Islamic terrorism. But in the late 1970s, Azzam was simply a charismatic professor who argued passionately that Muslims had both the right and the duty to fight against occupation and oppression. Osama absorbed these ideas like a sponge. The The shy, quiet young man who loved poetry was becoming an ideologue. Friends from university remembered intense discussions about Islamic theology that stretched late into the night. Osama spoke increasingly about the West's corrupting influence, about the need for Muslims to return to pure Islamic principles, about the obligation to resist foreign domination. His timing proved significant. The world Osama was observing in the late 1970s seemed to validate everything his teachers told him. In 1973, Egypt and Syria had attacked Israel in the Yom Kippur War, catching the Israelis by surprise. For a brief moment, it seemed Arab armies might finally achieve victory. Then, American weapons poured into Israel, the tide turned, and once again the Arabs were defeated. The message seemed clear. America would never allow Muslim nations to defeat Israel. Then came the Iranian Revolution of 1978-79. The Shah of Iran, a secular dictator backed by the United States, was overthrown by a popular uprising led by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. Iran transformed virtually overnight from a Western allied state into an Islamic republic governed by Sharia law. For young Islamists like Osama, this was intoxicating. It proved that Islamic revolution was possible, that the United States wasn't invincible, that faith could overcome military power. Osama completed his studies at Abdulaziz University in 1979. Whether he actually graduated remains disputed. It hardly mattered. His inherited wealth meant he would never need a degree to secure employment. More importantly, events were unfolding that would give his life direction and purpose. On December 24, 1979, Soviet tanks rolled across the border into Afghanistan. The invasion would transform Osama bin Laden from a wealthy dilettante with radical ideas into one of the most dangerous men in the world. To understand why Afghanistan's fate mattered so much to Osama bin Laden and thousands of other young Muslim men across the Middle East, one must understand what the Soviet invasion represented in the Islamist imagination. Afghanistan, though poor and remote, held profound symbolic importance. It was a Muslim country that had never been colonized by European powers. While Britain, France, and later America had carved up the Muslim world, Afghanistan had maintained independence. When Soviet forces invaded to prop up a Marxist regime, it represented everything Osama had been taught to hate, a godless superpower imposing its will on a Muslim nation. The government the Soviets supported, the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, had seized power in 1978 and immediately began implementing radical reforms. They promoted women's literacy, redistributed land, and, most offensive to traditional Muslims, began undermining religious authority. Mosques lost influence. Religious leaders were arrested. The new regime proclaimed that socialism, not Islam, would guide Afghanistan's future. Rural Afghans revolted almost immediately. The PDPA government, unable to contain the insurgency, called on Moscow for help. The Soviet Union, led by aging leaders still committed to spreading communism, obliged. By early 1980, 80,000 Soviet troops occupied Afghanistan's major cities. The invasion outraged Muslims worldwide. Saudi Arabia, America's key Arab ally, saw an opportunity to counter Soviet influence while simultaneously channeling its own restive young fundamentalists toward a foreign conflict rather than domestic dissent. The United States, still smarting from defeat in Vietnam and eager to give the Soviets their own quagmire, opened its wallet. Billions of dollars in weapons and funding began flowing to Pakistan, where various Afghan resistance groups, collectively known as the Mujahideen, meaning those who engage in jihad, were training and arming themselves. Osama bin Laden arrived in Pakistan in late 1979, almost immediately after finishing university. He was 22 years old, newly wealthy from his inheritance, fired up with religious fervor, and certain that this war represented Islam's great test. If Muslims could defeat a superpower defending Afghanistan, it would prove God truly favored the faithful. More practically, it might inspire similar uprisings across the Muslim world. Pakistan proved crucial to Osama's development. The Pakistani government, while officially secular, had long tolerated, even encouraged, Islamic fundamentalist groups operating on its soil. Pakistan's bitter rivalry with Hindu-majority India meant that supporting Islamic militants served strategic purposes. Training camps for fighters heading to Afghanistan dotted Pakistan's mountainous border regions. Pakistani intelligence services maintained relationships with the most extreme Mujahideen factions, seeing them as potential proxies in the broader Cold War. In Pakistan, Osama reconnected with Abdullah Azzam, his former university lecturer who had become one of the leading theorists of the Afghan jihad. Azzam had established an organization called Maktab al-Khidamat, the Office of Services, dedicated to recruiting Arab volunteers, raising money, and funneling fighters into Afghanistan. The organization operated openly with offices in dozens of countries. Wealthy Saudis, Egyptians, and other Arabs donated generously. Seeing the Afghan cause as noble and religiously obligatory, Azzam recognized Osama's potential immediately. Here was a young man with impeccable religious credentials, genuine ideological commitment, and most importantly, access to enormous wealth. Osama could do more than just fight. He could finance an entire network of fighters. Osama threw himself into the work with complete dedication. Initially, he focused on logistics rather than combat. Using his family's construction business connections, he began supplying materials and equipment to Mujahideen fighters. He funded the establishment of training camps in Pakistan, where Arab volunteers learned weapons handling, explosives, and guerrilla tactics before crossing into Afghanistan. He traveled between Pakistan and Afghanistan regularly, visiting Mujahideen strongholds in the mountains, meeting fighters, understanding their needs. By 1984, Osama and Azzam had formalized their relationship, expanding Maktab al-Khidamat's operations substantially. They established recruiting networks across the Middle East. Osama's Saudi connections proved invaluable. He could approach wealthy donors directly, appealing to both religious duty and anti-communist sentiment. Money poured in. With it came volunteers, young men from Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Algeria, even Muslims from Western countries, all eager to fight the Soviet invaders. The war itself had settled into a brutal stalemate. Soviet forces controlled cities and major roads, but the Mujahideen controlled most of the countryside, particularly the mountainous east. The Hindu Kush mountain range that dominates much of Afghanistan provided perfect terrain for guerrilla warfare. Soviet convoys faced constant ambushes. Helicopter gunships prowled valleys, searching for insurgent camps. The Soviets responded to attacks with indiscriminate brutality, bombing villages suspected of harboring fighters, laying millions of landmines across the countryside. The human cost was staggering. By the mid-1980s, approximately 1 million Afghans had died. 4 million more, nearly a third of the population, had fled to refugee camps in Pakistan and Iran. The Soviets were suffering too. Thousands of young Russian conscripts were dying in a war that seemed unwinnable, in a place most Russians couldn't find on a map. By 1986, Osama had moved beyond logistics and fundraising. He established his own base in eastern Afghanistan, near the Pakistani border, called Al-Masada, the Lion's Den. Here, several hundred Arab fighters loyal to Osama trained and launched operations against Soviet positions. These fighters weren't Afghans. They were volunteers from across the Muslim world, bound together by religious ideology rather than nationality. They saw themselves as an international Islamic army. In April 1987, Al-Masada faced its first major test. Soviet and Afghan government forces launched an assault on the base, attempting to overrun what intelligence suggested was an important Mujahideen position. What followed became known as the Battle of Jarji. The fight lasted approximately 2 weeks. Osama's force, perhaps 200 fighters, faced several thousand Soviet-backed troops supported by artillery, armor, and air power. The Afghans should have been obliterated. Instead, using the mountainous terrain skillfully, setting ambushes and displaying suicidal bravery, Osama's fighters held out. They inflicted significant casualties before finally withdrawing deeper into the mountains. Tactically, the battle was inconclusive. Strategically, it hardly mattered in the broader war, but the propaganda value was enormous. A young Saudi journalist named Jamal Khashoggi, who would become internationally famous decades later for very different reasons, covered the battle extensively. His reports, distributed throughout the Arab world, portrayed Osama bin Laden as a hero who had personally faced Soviet troops and lived. Whether Osama actually participated in the fighting remains debated. Some accounts suggest he spent most of the battle in a command bunker, but the narrative took hold. Osama bin Laden had fought the superpower and survived. The legend grew throughout 1987 and 1988. Arab newspapers published stories about the brave Mujahideen defeating godless communists. Osama became a celebrity in Saudi Arabia and across the Middle East. Young men who heard these stories decided they too wanted to join the jihad. Donations increased. Osama's influence expanded. Behind the scenes, something even more significant was taking shape. In 1988, as it became increasingly clear the Soviets would eventually withdraw from Afghanistan, Osama and Abdullah Azzam began discussing what should happen to the international network they'd built. They'd created an infrastructure, training camps, funding networks, recruitment pipelines, experienced fighters, international contacts. All this would remain after the Afghan war ended. Some argued the organization should simply disband, its mission accomplished. Azzam himself wavered, suggesting it might be better to focus on defending other Muslim lands under threat, Palestine, Kashmir, Chechnya, through legitimate, defensive jihad. Osama disagreed. He envisioned something more ambitious, a permanent organization dedicated to waging jihad against all enemies of Islam worldwide. Not just defensive operations, but offensive campaigns to spread Islamic governance and expel non-Muslim influence from the entire Muslim world. An organization that would continue fighting until an Islamic caliphate was re-established across the Middle East and beyond. On August 11, 1988, in a house in Peshawar, Pakistan, Osama bin Laden held a meeting with close associates to establish exactly such an organization. They needed a name. Someone suggested Al-Qaeda, Arabic for the base or the foundation. The name stuck. Al-Qaeda was born. Its stated objectives were ambitious to the point of delusion: expel American and Western influence from the Muslim world, destroy Israel, overthrow Muslim governments deemed insufficiently Islamic, and ultimately establish a unified Islamic caliphate governed by Sharia law. Its methods would include guerrilla warfare, terrorism, and propaganda. At the time, few outside jihadi circles had heard of Al-Qaeda. It was just one of many small extremist groups. The CIA was aware of Osama bin Laden's fundraising activities. His limited contacts with American intelligence officers in Pakistan during the war had been documented, but considered him relatively minor, certainly not a threat to the United States. This assessment would prove catastrophically wrong. By late 1988, the Soviet withdrawal was underway. Mikhail Gorbachev, the reformist Soviet leader, had concluded the war was unwinnable and economically ruinous. Soviet troops began pulling out in February 1989, with the last soldiers crossing back into Soviet territory on February 15, 1989, after a decade of war, 15,000 Soviet dead, and hundreds of billions of rubles spent. The Soviet Union admitted defeat. For Osama and the thousands of Arab fighters who joined the Afghan jihad, victory seemed to prove God's favor. They had faced a superpower and won. A ragtag force of religious warriors had defeated one of the world's two greatest military powers. The lesson seemed obvious. Faith and dedication could overcome any enemy, no matter how powerful. This lesson would soon be applied against the other superpower. As 1989 drew to a close, Osama bin Laden prepared to return to Saudi Arabia. He anticipated a hero's welcome. He possessed enormous wealth, international connections, battle experience, and most importantly, the infrastructure of a global jihadist network in Al-Qaeda. What he didn't possess was patience or pragmatism. Within 2 years, his confrontational approach would see him exiled from his homeland. Within a decade, he would become the world's most wanted terrorist. And within 12 years, he would orchestrate an attack that would kill thousands and transform global politics for generations. The privileged son of a billionaire was about to become the world's most dangerous man. In spring 1989, Osama bin Laden returned to Saudi Arabia, expecting celebration. He got it. At first, the Afghan war had made him famous throughout the Arab world. Newspapers had chronicled his exploits. Religious scholars praised his dedication to jihad. Wealthy Saudis who donated to the cause through his networks wanted to meet the young man who'd helped defeat the Soviet Union. At age 32, Osama had transformed from a quiet, wealthy eccentric into a respected figure in Saudi Arabia's religious and business communities. He returned to his family's construction empire, the Saudi bin Laden Group, which had continued thriving during his absence. His older brothers, particularly Bakr bin Laden, who ran the company, welcomed him back. They assumed Osama would settle down, apply his organizational talents to profitable ventures, perhaps continue some modest charitable work related to Islamic causes. They misread their half-brother entirely. Osama had no intention of retiring to a comfortable life managing construction projects. Afghanistan had shown him that dedicated believers could change history. The Soviet Union, a nuclear-armed superpower, had been forced to withdraw in humiliation. If that was possible, what else might be achieved? He began meeting regularly with like-minded jihadists, many of whom had also returned from Afghanistan. These men shared his conviction that the jihad couldn't end with the Soviet withdrawal. Islamic fundamentalism, they believed, needed to spread. Secular Muslim governments that oppressed religious practice needed to be confronted. Western influence needed to be expelled from the Islamic world. Osama also reconnected with his growing family. His first wife, Najwa, had borne him multiple children during the 1980s, even while he was frequently in Pakistan or Afghanistan. He'd taken additional wives as well. Islamic law permits up to 4 simultaneous wives, and Osama would marry at least 5 women over his lifetime, though never maintaining more than 4 marriages concurrently. His household was expanding rapidly with children from multiple wives, but domestic tranquility wasn't Osama's priority. He spent his time and money building Al-Qaeda's infrastructure. He used Saudi bin Laden Group resources to establish connections across the Middle East. He met with Egyptian Islamic militants, whose movement against Egypt's secular government had produced some of the most radical theorists in the jihadist world. He cultivated relationships with fundamentalists in Yemen, Sudan, and elsewhere. His activities soon attracted the Saudi government's attention and concern. The Saudi monarchy occupied a peculiar position. The kingdom had been founded on Wahhabi religious principles and maintained strict Islamic governance internally. Yet it was also the United States' closest Arab ally, hosting American military advisors, purchasing American weapons, and serving as a cornerstone of U.S. Middle East policy. This balance between religious conservatism and American partnership required careful management. Osama's increasingly vocal criticism of other Muslim governments threatened this balance. Saudi intelligence services began monitoring him. They warned him quietly to moderate his activities. Osama ignored these warnings. He believed he enjoyed sufficient protection through his family's connections to the royal family. Then came the event that would shatter this assumption and set Osama irreversibly on his path toward global terrorism. August 2nd, 1990, Iraqi tanks rolled across the border into Kuwait. Saddam Hussein, Iraq's brutal dictator, had multiple motives for the invasion. Iraq had spent the 1980s fighting a devastating war against Iran, a war the United States and Saudi Arabia had supported with loans totaling billions of dollars. Now the war was over. Iraq was victorious but bankrupt, owing massive debts it couldn't repay. Kuwait, one of the world's wealthiest nations per capita thanks to vast oil reserves, was Iraq's largest creditor. Hussein's solution was simple: invade Kuwait, seize its oil fields, cancel the debt, and perhaps solve Iraq's economic crisis through conquest. Within 48 hours, Iraqi forces had overrun the tiny emirate. Kuwait's royal family fled. Hussein declared Kuwait to be Iraq's 19th province. The international reaction was immediate and overwhelming. The United Nations Security Council condemned the invasion. President George H.W. Bush declared it would not stand. Within weeks, the United States began assembling a massive military coalition to liberate Kuwait. Britain, France, Egypt, Syria, and dozens of other nations pledged forces. Saudi Arabia agreed to serve as the staging ground for the military buildup. And here, Osama bin Laden saw opportunity and disaster. He requested a meeting with King Fahd, Saudi Arabia's ruler. The meeting, arranged through family connections, took place in autumn 1990 as American forces were beginning to arrive in Saudi Arabia. Imagine the scene. A 33-year-old man, however wealthy and accomplished, presenting himself before the aging king of one of the world's richest nations. Osama came with a proposal he genuinely believed the king would accept. "Your Majesty," Osama reportedly argued, "there is no need for American forces on our sacred soil. I can provide an Islamic army to defend the kingdom against any Iraqi aggression. The fighters who defeated the Soviets in Afghanistan are available. We need only weapons and permission." King Fahd's response was diplomatic but firm. "Thank you for your offer, but we will accept American assistance." To Osama, this was betrayal of the highest order. Saudi Arabia was not merely another Muslim country. It was the birthplace of Islam, home to Mecca and Medina, the two holiest sites in the Islamic world. Every Muslim on earth, when praying 5 times daily, faced toward Mecca. Millions made pilgrimage there annually. In Osama's understanding of Islam, allowing non-Muslim military forces into this sacred land was sacrilege. Yet as autumn 1990 progressed, hundreds of thousands of American, British, French, and other Western troops poured into Saudi Arabia. They established bases, airfields, supply depots. American soldiers, some of them women, which particularly infuriated religious conservatives, were stationed mere miles from Islam's holiest sites. Osama didn't accept the king's decision quietly. He began speaking publicly against the American presence, giving sermons at mosques, distributing pamphlets, meeting with Saudi Arabia's religious scholars, the ulama, trying to convince them to issue a fatwa, a religious decree condemning the American military presence. Most religious scholars refused. The Saudi government paid their salaries and provided their positions. They understood that opposing the king's decision meant losing their livelihoods. But even beyond self-interest, many genuinely believed Kuwait needed liberation, and Iraq posed a real threat to Saudi Arabia. Osama's campaign was gaining no traction, but it was gaining attention, the wrong kind. On January 16, 1991, Operation Desert Storm commenced. American and coalition aircraft began a devastating bombing campaign against Iraqi forces in Kuwait and Iraq itself. The air campaign lasted 6 weeks, systematically destroying Iraq's air defenses, military infrastructure, and command systems. When the ground invasion finally began on February 24th, Iraqi forces, demoralized, depleted, and cut off, collapsed within days. By February 28th, Kuwait was liberated. President Bush, with memories of Vietnam still fresh, decided against marching to Baghdad and removing Hussein from power. Coalition forces withdrew, leaving Hussein's regime intact but crippled by economic sanctions. The swift victory vindicated King Fahd's decision to accept American help. But for Osama, the entire episode represented catastrophic defeat, not military, but spiritual. The Americans had proven they could project overwhelming force into the Middle East. They demonstrated that Arab armies, even Iraq's, were no match for Western military technology. And most galling to Osama, they'd done it from bases on Saudi soil, with the Saudi government's full cooperation. Throughout 1991, Osama continued his denunciations of the Saudi regime. He was no longer subtle or careful. He called the royal family corrupt, accused them of betraying Islam, demanded the immediate expulsion of all American forces from the Arabian Peninsula. The Saudi government had tolerated his criticism during the build-up to war, hoping he'd quiet down afterward. Instead, he intensified his attacks. Finally, in 1991, they'd had enough. Osama was given an ultimatum: stop these activities or leave the country. He chose exile. In 1992, Osama bin Laden relocated to Sudan, a sprawling, impoverished nation in northeastern Africa, where the Sahara Desert meets the Nile River Valley. Sudan in the early 1990s was governed by Omar al-Bashir, an army officer who'd seized power in 1989. Bashir had immediately implemented strict Sharia law and invited Islamic fundamentalists from across the Muslim world to establish operations in Sudan. His motivation was partly ideological. He genuinely supported Islamic fundamentalism and partly practical. By hosting these groups, he gained powerful allies and positioned Sudan as a leader in the global Islamist movement. The man who'd invited Osama specifically was Hassan al-Turabi, Sudan's most powerful political figure after Bashir himself. Al-Turabi led the National Islamic Front and served as Speaker of Sudan's parliament. He'd met Osama during the Afghan war and recognized his potential. Sudan, Al-Turabi calculated, would benefit from hosting the wealthy Saudi and his growing network. Osama didn't merely seek refuge in Sudan, he effectively purchased a piece of it. He acquired land, established a fortified compound outside Khartoum, the capital, and built a manor house in the city itself. He brought his wives and children, creating a family compound surrounded by armed guards equipped with advanced weapons. But Osama wasn't content with comfortable exile. Sudan became Al-Qaeda's primary base of operations throughout the mid-1990s. Training camps were established in remote areas where recruits from across the Muslim world learned weapons handling, explosives manufacture, and tactics. Osama used his business expertise to establish legitimate companies, construction firms, agricultural operations, import-export businesses that both generated revenue and provided cover for moving operatives and materials. The Sudan years represented Al-Qaeda's transformation from a loose network of Afghan war veterans into a truly international terrorist organization. Osama established cells in Egypt, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, and beyond. He forged alliances with existing terrorist groups, including Egyptian Islamic Jihad, whose leader, Ayman al-Zawahiri, would eventually become Osama's closest associate and successor. The relationship was mutually beneficial initially. Sudan gained international legitimacy by hosting conferences on Islamic governance. Osama gained freedom to build his network without interference. He even helped the Sudanese government with infrastructure projects, using his construction expertise to build roads, just as his father had done decades earlier in Saudi Arabia. But this arrangement couldn't last. The United States had been watching. American intelligence services had tracked Osama since the Afghan war, but he'd been considered relatively low priority, a wealthy fundraiser for jihadist causes, certainly but not necessarily a direct threat to American interests. The Gulf War and his subsequent radicalization changed this assessment. By the mid-1990s, the CIA was conducting daily surveillance of Osama's compound in Sudan. Satellite imagery tracked his movements. Intelligence officers identified his associates. The US government began pressuring Sudan to expel him. Then came the terrorist attacks. In December 1992, a bomb exploded at the Gold Mihor Hotel in Aden, Yemen. 2 Austrian tourists died. The hotel had been housing American troops en route to Somalia for a humanitarian mission. American intelligence quickly linked the bombing to operatives trained in Osama's camps. In February 1993, a massive truck bomb detonated in the parking garage beneath the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City. The explosion killed 6 people, injured over 1,000, and carved a 7-story crater through multiple levels of the tower. The bomber, Ramzi Youssef, had trained in Al-Qaeda camps in Afghanistan. Though the connection wasn't immediately clear, investigators eventually established that Youssef had ties to Osama's network. These attacks terrified American officials, not because of the casualties, relatively low by later standards, but because they demonstrated that Islamic terrorists could strike inside the United States itself. The Trade Center bombing especially shocked the nation. The towers were global symbols of American economic power. They'd been targeted deliberately, symbolically. Additional pressure on Sudan intensified. By 1996, economic sanctions had begun seriously damaging Sudan's already fragile economy. More importantly, the political winds shifted in Khartoum. Omar al-Bashir, consolidating his personal power, no longer needed Hassan al-Turabi as an ally. Al-Turabi, Osama's primary protector, was marginalized. In May 1996, Sudanese officials delivered the message: Osama needed to leave. He'd lost his homeland and now his refuge. At age 39, one of the world's wealthiest men was effectively stateless. His response to this humiliation would be devastating. In August 1996, Osama bin Laden returned to Afghanistan. The country he'd fought in during the 1980s had changed dramatically. After the Soviet withdrawal, Afghanistan had descended into brutal civil war. Various mujahideen factions, united against foreign invaders but divided by ethnicity, ideology, and ambition, turned their weapons on each other. The fighting was vicious. Kabul, the capital, was devastated by artillery bombardments. Hundreds of thousands died. Millions fled to refugee camps. Then, in 1994, a new force emerged, the Taliban, meaning students in Pashto. The movement began among young men educated in radical madrasas, religious schools, in Pakistan. These students, many of them orphans from the Soviet war, had been taught an extremely rigid interpretation of Islam. When they seized their first Afghan city, they imposed harsh Sharia law, public executions, banning music and television, forcing women into complete seclusion, requiring men to grow beards. The Taliban's extreme ideology was offset, in many Afghans' eyes, by their effectiveness at restoring order. By September 1996, when Osama returned, the Taliban controlled most of Afghanistan, including Kabul. Their leader, Mullah Muhammad Omar, was a one-eyed former mujahid who'd lost his eye fighting Soviets. Omar welcomed Osama as an honored guest and fellow veteran of the anti-Soviet jihad. He offered Al-Qaeda complete freedom to establish training camps and operations. The Taliban and Al-Qaeda were natural allies. Both embraced extreme interpretations of Islam. Both saw jihad as central to Islamic practice. Both despised the West. Osama wasted no time. On August 23, 1996, shortly after arriving, he issued a formal declaration of war against the United States. The statement, distributed through Islamic media channels and eventually picked up by Western media, was titled Declaration of War against the Americans occupying the land of the two holy places. The document ran to thousands of words, but its core argument was straightforward. American military forces had occupied Saudi Arabia since 1990. This occupation of land containing Islam's holiest sites was an act of war against all Muslims. Every Muslim therefore had a religious obligation to fight Americans anywhere in the world until they withdrew from the Arabian Peninsula. The declaration also cited American support for Israel, American sanctions against Iraq that were causing massive civilian suffering, and American support for corrupt regimes oppressing Muslims. But the Saudi occupation remained central. Osama had never forgiven King Fahd's decision 6 years earlier. Western intelligence services noted the declaration, but didn't necessarily view it as an immediate threat. Osama had been issuing inflammatory rhetoric for years. His actual capability to strike the United States, particularly on American soil, seemed limited. This assessment was catastrophically wrong. If the 1996 declaration of war was merely words, the events of August 7, 1998 were brutal clarification. That morning began normally in two East African capitals, in Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. Diplomats and local employees arrived at their respective U.S. embassies to begin another workday. The embassies were obvious symbols of American presence, large compounds flying the American flag, staffed by dozens of U.S. personnel processing visa applications for locals hoping to visit America. They were also, in Osama's calculus, legitimate targets. At 10:39 a.m. East African time, a truck bomb detonated outside the U.S. Embassy in Nairobi. The explosion was massive. Over 500 cylinders of TNT packed around aluminum nitrate fertilizer designed to direct the blast toward the embassy building. The truck had crashed through a security gate moments earlier, though guards had managed to stop it in the parking area rather than allowing it to reach the building itself. The blast was heard miles away. Windows shattered across downtown Nairobi. The embassy's facade collapsed. Nearby buildings were severely damaged, including a secretarial college where students were trapped under rubble. The death toll was horrific. 213 people killed, including 12 Americans. More than 4,000 injured, many by flying glass from shattered windows blocks away. 4 minutes later, 10:43 a.m. local time, a second truck bomb exploded outside the U.S. Embassy in Dar es Salaam. This explosion was somewhat less deadly, primarily because the embassy compound there had more open space and stronger construction. Still, 11 people died and 85 were injured. The simultaneous nature of the attacks left no doubt they were coordinated. Within hours, investigators found evidence linking the bombings to Al-Qaeda. Witnesses in both cities had noticed the trucks. Fragments recovered from the blast sites contained distinctive materials. Communication intercepts, analyzed after the fact, had picked up suspicious activity in the days before. Most damning, a few days after the attacks, several men were arrested at Karachi airport in Pakistan attempting to flee. Under interrogation, they admitted involvement and identified Osama bin Laden as the operation's architect. The FBI immediately placed Osama on its 10 most wanted list, offering a $5 million reward for information leading to his capture. American intelligence services, which had been watching him with moderate interest, suddenly mobilized completely. This wasn't random terrorism, it was a coordinated assault on American sovereign territory, embassies, legally being considered U.S. soil, that had killed hundreds and demonstrated sophisticated planning. President Bill Clinton ordered retaliatory strikes. On August 20, 1998, U.S. Navy ships launched cruise missiles at suspected Al-Qaeda training camps in Afghanistan and at a pharmaceutical factory in Sudan believed to be producing chemical weapons for Al-Qaeda. The strikes killed approximately 20 people at the camps, none of them senior Al-Qaeda figures, and destroyed the Sudanese factory, which turned out to produce only legitimate pharmaceuticals. The retaliation was militarily insignificant but politically important. It demonstrated that America would strike back. It also validated Osama's narrative that America was at war with Islam, bombing Muslim countries, killing Muslims. Osama was now unquestionably the world's most wanted terrorist. But he wasn't done. The embassy bombings, devastating as they were, represented preparation for something far worse. Sometime in late 1998 or early 1999, in a meeting at one of Al-Qaeda's Afghan compounds, a Pakistani terrorist named Khalid Sheikh Mohammed presented Osama with an audacious proposal. Mohammed was a veteran jihadist who'd been involved in numerous plots, including potentially the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. He'd been thinking about aircraft as weapons, not bombs placed on planes that had been tried many times, rather hijacking planes and flying them into buildings. The planes themselves would become missiles, loaded with thousands of gallons of jet fuel that would ignite on impact. The concept wasn't entirely new. In 1994, hijackers had considered crashing a plane into the Eiffel Tower. In 1995, Philippine authorities had uncovered plots involving aircraft, but no one had successfully executed such an attack. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed's proposal was ambitious: hijack multiple commercial aircraft simultaneously, fly them into significant American landmarks, create devastation so massive it would force America to withdraw from the Middle East entirely. Osama listened. Then he approved the operation. The planning took years. The first requirement was finding suitable operatives. They needed men who were absolutely committed to martyrdom, willing to die for the cause. They also needed men who could function in Western society without arousing suspicion, meaning they needed to speak English, understand Western culture, and appear moderate rather than overtly fundamentalist. Through 1999 and into 2000, Al-Qaeda screened candidates. Mohammed Atta, an Egyptian who'd studied architecture in Germany, emerged as the obvious leader. He was intelligent, disciplined, spoke fluent English and German, and had become increasingly radicalized while in Europe. Marwan al-Shehi from the United Arab Emirates had also studied in Germany and shared Atta's commitment. Zia Jara, a Lebanese man, provided additional sophistication. He had a Western girlfriend, drank occasionally, appeared thoroughly secular to casual observers. Then there was the crucial requirement: someone who could actually fly a commercial aircraft. They found Hani Hanjour, a Saudi who'd obtained a commercial pilot's license in the United States. His flying instructors later reported he was a mediocre pilot at best, but he understood basic aircraft operation. By late 2000, 19 men had been selected and organized into 4 cells. 15 were Saudi, 2 Emirati, 1 Egyptian, 1 Lebanese. They began arriving in the United States throughout late 2000 and early 2001, entering legally on tourist or student visas. Once inside America, the hijackers lived ordinary lives, or appeared to. They rented apartments in Florida, California, and Arizona. Some enrolled in flight schools, particularly the pilots, who took lessons on small aircraft and then on flight simulators. They worked out at gyms, developing physical fitness. They studied airline procedures, airport security, aircraft layouts. Incredibly, despite multiple opportunities, American intelligence services never identified the plot. Some of the hijackers were on watch lists. Several had been flagged as potentially suspicious in various databases. But information wasn't shared between agencies. The FBI, CIA, and immigration services didn't communicate effectively. The dots were never connected. By summer 2001, the operation was ready. Target selection had been finalized: the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York, the Pentagon in Virginia, and either the U.S. Capitol building or the White House in Washington. The date was chosen carefully, not as popular belief suggests because it produced 911 in American date notation. Rather, Osama chose September 11th for its historical symbolism. On September 11, 1683, Polish King John Sobieski III had arrived at Vienna with a relief army to break the Turkish-Ottoman siege of the Austrian capital. The siege's collapse marked the end of Ottoman expansion into Christian Europe and the beginning of European powers' gradual encroachment into Muslim lands. For Osama, carrying out his attacks on this date would symbolically reverse that historical turning point. Islam would strike back at the West's heart on the anniversary of Islam's greatest European defeat. Everything was in position. The hijackers had their tickets. The plan was finalized. All that remained was execution. The morning of September 11, 2001 began with clear skies along America's east coast, perfect flying weather. At 7:59 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11 departed Boston's Logan Airport, bound for Los Angeles. Aboard were 76 passengers, 11 crew members, and 5 hijackers. 15 minutes later, United Airlines Flight 175 departed the same airport on the same route. It carried 51 passengers, 9 crew, and 5 hijackers. At 8:20 a.m., American Airlines Flight 77 took off from Dulles International Airport near Washington, D.C., heading for Los Angeles. Among its 53 passengers, 6 crew members were 5 hijackers. At 8:42 a.m., United Airlines Flight 93 departed Newark International Airport in New Jersey, bound for San Francisco. It carried 33 passengers, 7 crew, and only 4 hijackers, the smallest team. Within minutes of each plane reaching cruising altitude, the hijackers moved. They were armed with box cutters and small knives, weapons that could pass through 2001-era airport security. They stormed the cockpits, killed or subdued the pilots, and took control. At 8:46 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11 crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center between the 93rd and 99th floors, traveling approximately 465 miles per hour. The impact was catastrophic. The plane's wings sliced through the building like a hot knife through butter. Thousands of gallons of jet fuel ignited instantly, creating a massive fireball visible for miles. In lower Manhattan, people stopped and stared. Many assumed it was a terrible accident, perhaps a small plane with a lost pilot. News cameras turned toward the burning tower. 17 minutes later, at 9:03 a.m. as the world watched, United Airlines Flight 175 struck the South Tower between the 77th and 85th floors at approximately 590 miles per hour. This time, there was no doubt. America was under attack. Both towers were now burning infernos. On the upper floors, above the impact zones, roughly 1,400 people were trapped. The planes had destroyed staircases and elevators. Fire and smoke filled the corridors. Temperatures exceeded 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Some of those trapped made desperate decisions. They appeared in windows, waving clothing, hoping for rescue that couldn't come. Others, facing the choice between burning alive or jumping, chose to jump. Approximately 200 people fell from the towers that morning. Television cameras captured these moments, desperate human beings falling through the air, and then news directors made the decision to stop showing this footage. It was too horrific. At 9:37 a.m., American Airlines Flight 77 struck the western wall of the Pentagon, headquarters of the U.S. Department of Defense. The plane, traveling at 530 miles per hour, penetrated 3 of the building's 5 concentric rings. The Pentagon was better built than the towers. It was designed to withstand attacks, but the impact still caused massive damage. The building burned. 125 people inside died, along with all 64 aboard the aircraft. Only United Airlines Flight 93 failed to reach its target. Passengers on this flight, having learned via cell phone calls about the other attacks, realized they were on a suicide mission. A group of passengers, led by Todd Beamer, who famously said, "Let's roll," before the attempt, rushed the cockpit to overcome the hijackers. At 10:03 a.m., Flight 93 crashed into a field near Shanksville, Pennsylvania, killing all 44 aboard. The intended target, believed to be either the Capitol building or White House, was spared. The passengers' sacrifice prevented what would have been an even greater catastrophe. Back in New York, the situation was deteriorating. At 9:59 a.m., the South Tower collapsed. The steel structure, weakened by intense heat from burning jet fuel, could no longer support the building's weight. The upper floors pancaked down onto lower floors, creating a cascading collapse. The entire 110-story tower fell in approximately 10 seconds, creating an enormous dust cloud that rolled through lower Manhattan like a pyroclastic flow from a volcano. 29 minutes later, at 10:28 a.m., the North Tower collapsed in the same manner. The final toll was almost incomprehensible. In the Twin Towers, 2,606 people dead, including hundreds of firefighters and police officers who'd rushed into the buildings attempting rescue. At the Pentagon, 125 dead. On Flight 93, 44 dead. On the other 3 flights, 246 dead. In total, 2,977 people murdered in a matter of hours. The psychological impact was even more devastating than the death toll. The attacks had been designed for maximum horror, aircraft striking the world's most recognizable buildings, creating images that would burn into collective memory forever. The attacks were broadcast live. The second plane strike, the collapses, the chaos, hundreds of millions watched in real time. Osama bin Laden's message to America was delivered not in words, but in falling towers and thousands of corpses. Osama bin Laden's initial response to 9/11 was denial. On September 16, 2001, a statement attributed to him was broadcast by Al Jazeera, the Qatar-based news network. In it, he denied responsibility. "I stress that I have not carried out this act, which appears to have been carried out by individuals with their own motivation." The denial was transparent nonsense. American intelligence services immediately traced the attacks to Al-Qaeda. The hijackers' identities were quickly established. Their connections to Al-Qaeda training camps were documented. Communications intercepts, financial records, witness testimony, everything pointed to Osama. Why deny it? Perhaps he feared immediate retaliation before Al-Qaeda could prepare. Perhaps he wanted to maintain some veneer of deniability. Perhaps he was simply testing to see if the West would believe the denial. They didn't. Within days, the United States government publicly declared Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda responsible for the attacks. President George W. Bush addressed Congress, declaring, "Our war on terror begins with Al-Qaeda, but it does not end there." Over subsequent years, as the initial shock wore off and Osama realized there would be no question of his guilt, his rhetoric shifted from denial to justification to pride. In 2004, a new video surfaced. In it, Osama spoke directly to the camera. "We decided to destroy towers in America. God knows that it had not occurred to our minds to attack the towers. But after our patience ran out and we saw the injustice and inflexibility of the American-Israeli alliance toward our people in Palestine and Lebanon, this came to my mind," he continued, explaining that the idea crystallized while watching Israel's 1982 invasion of Lebanon, which had involved extensive bombing of Beirut, including the destruction of many high-rise buildings. The image of falling towers in Beirut, he claimed, inspired the idea of destroying towers in America. The symbolism was deliberate, American towers falling just as Lebanese towers had fallen. Additional admissions followed in 2006. Video footage emerged showing Osama meeting with some of the hijackers before the attacks, discussing the operation. He described his pleasure watching the towers fall, his surprise that the collapses had been total rather than partial. The architect of history's deadliest terrorist attack was no longer hiding behind denials. He was boasting, but by then, Osama bin Laden was already being hunted across Afghanistan and Pakistan by the most powerful military machine ever assembled. September 18, 2001, 7 days after the attacks, the United States Congress passed a joint resolution authorizing President Bush to use all necessary and appropriate force against those responsible for 9/11. The authorization was nearly unanimous. Only one member of Congress voted against it. America, unified in grief and rage, demanded justice. The Taliban government in Afghanistan faced an immediate ultimatum: surrender Osama bin Laden and dismantle Al-Qaeda's infrastructure, or be considered complicit in the attacks. Mullah Muhammad Omar, the Taliban's one-eyed leader, refused. He invoked Pashtunwali, the traditional code of honor among Afghanistan's dominant ethnic group, which demands absolute protection for guests. Bin Laden was his guest. Honor forbade surrender. This decision sealed the Taliban's fate. On October 7, 2001, American and British aircraft began bombing Taliban positions across Afghanistan. The air campaign was devastating. Precision-guided munitions struck command centers, ammunition depots, airfields. The Taliban possessed no air force, no air defenses capable of challenging American aircraft. They could only watch as their military infrastructure was systematically destroyed, but air power alone couldn't win the war. Ground forces were needed. The U.S. strategy was clever. Rather than immediately commit massive numbers of American troops, CIA operatives and Special Forces soldiers linked up with the Northern Alliance, an Afghan resistance movement that had been fighting the Taliban for years. These fighters knew the terrain, spoke the languages, understood local politics. American advisors embedded with Northern Alliance units, coordinating airstrikes and providing modern weapons. The combination proved devastatingly effective. Taliban positions bombarded from the air and assaulted on the ground crumbled. City after city fell. On November 12, 2001, just over a month into the war, Northern Alliance and American forces entered Kabul, Afghanistan's capital. The Taliban fled south toward Kandahar, their spiritual heartland. One night during the Kabul offensive, an American airstrike killed Mohammed Atef, Al-Qaeda's number 3 figure and chief military commander. He'd been one of Osama's closest advisors for years. His death sent a message. America could reach even senior Al-Qaeda leadership. By early December, the Taliban made their last stand in Kandahar. When it fell, the regime collapsed. An interim government was established under Hamid Karzai, a Pashtun leader acceptable to most factions. After just 2 months, the war appeared won. But where was Osama bin Laden? Intelligence reports placed Osama in eastern Afghanistan, near the Pakistani border, in a region called Tora Bora. The name means black dust in the local dialect, an apt description for the harsh, mountainous terrain. Tora Bora wasn't just mountains. It was a vast complex of natural caves and tunnels that the Mujahideen had used during the Soviet War. Osama himself had helped develop some of these fortifications in the 1980s using his family's construction expertise. The caves were equipped with ventilation systems, weapons storage, even primitive medical facilities. Multiple entrances and exits made them nearly impossible to fully seal off. In early December 2001, American intelligence intercepted radio communications that they believed were Osama directing Al-Qaeda fighters in Tora Bora. Voice analysis suggested it was genuinely him. Satellite imagery showed unusual activity in the region, groups of fighters moving at night, supply convoys heading toward the mountains. On December 3rd, American forces launched the Battle of Tora Bora. The force was surprisingly small, approximately 70 American Special Forces operators, several dozen CIA paramilitary officers, and about 1,000 Afghan militia fighters recruited locally. They faced an estimated 1,000–2,000 Al-Qaeda fighters dug into mountain positions. The battle lasted nearly 2 weeks. American aircraft pounded suspected cave positions with heavy bombs, including several Daisy Cutter bombs, 15,000-pound monsters designed to obliterate everything within hundreds of yards. Special Forces operators called in airstrikes, coordinated Afghan militia attacks, and occasionally entered caves themselves to clear them. It was brutal fighting in freezing conditions at high altitude. Al-Qaeda fighters, many of them veterans of the Soviet War, knew exactly how to defend mountainous terrain. They'd established overlapping fields of fire, used caves to avoid airstrikes, and fought with suicidal determination. But American firepower was overwhelming. By mid-December, Al-Qaeda's resistance was crumbling. Surviving fighters attempted to escape, fleeing through mountain passes toward Pakistan. And here, American strategy failed catastrophically. The force at Tora Bora was too small to seal the entire border region. Pakistani forces, theoretically allied with the US and positioned on the other side of the border, were supposed to intercept fleeing fighters. But Pakistan's commitment was questionable at best. Many Pakistani intelligence officers maintained sympathies with Islamic militants. Some actively aided Al-Qaeda's escape. Osama bin Laden slipped through American fingers. Intelligence analysts later concluded with high confidence that Osama had indeed been at Tora Bora during the battle. Radio intercepts captured what appeared to be his voice giving orders. But sometime in mid-December, as American forces were still clearing caves, he escaped across the border into Pakistan's tribal areas. The failure to capture or kill him at Tora Bora would haunt American military planners for a decade. They'd come so close perhaps within miles, and let him escape because they'd committed insufficient forces. The world's most wanted man had vanished into Pakistan's lawless frontier regions. Osama bin Laden's whereabouts between late 2001 and 2011 remain partially mysterious even today. CIA analysts have pieced together parts of his movements, but significant gaps persist. Initially, he almost certainly remained in Pakistan's federally administered tribal areas, mountainous regions near the Afghan border where Pakistan's central government exercised minimal control. These areas operated under tribal law. Pashtun tribes that straddled the Pakistan-Afghanistan border maintained strong traditions of sheltering fugitives. Pakistani military and intelligence services nominally conducted operations against militants in these regions, but their efforts were often half-hearted. Osama moved frequently during these early years, never staying in one location long. He traveled with a small group of bodyguards and family members. Several wives and some of his numerous children had accompanied him even after 9/11. Communication was dangerous. Any electronic transmission could potentially be intercepted and traced. He relied on trusted couriers to carry messages, maintaining contact with Al-Qaeda's dispersed network through these human channels. The hunted man's lifestyle was paranoid and austere, a far cry from the wealth he'd enjoyed in youth. He avoided phones, internet, even watches with GPS capability. Messages were written by hand, carried by courier to distant locations where they were transcribed digitally and sent. Responses followed the same laborious path in reverse. This system made real-time communication impossible, but was nearly untraceable. Meanwhile, Al-Qaeda continued operations despite losing its primary sanctuary in Afghanistan. The organization had become decentralized by necessity, with regional affiliates operating semi-autonomously. Major attacks occurred throughout the 2000s, the Bali nightclub bombing in 2002, 202 dead, the Madrid train bombings in 2004, 193 dead, the London transport bombings in 2005, 52 dead. Whether Osama personally approved these operations or merely inspired them was often unclear. His operational control had diminished, but his symbolic importance remained enormous. American forces, having failed to capture him at Tora Bora, continued pursuing him throughout the 2000s. The manhunt was the most expensive and intensive in history. The CIA established a dedicated unit, codenamed Alex Station, focused exclusively on finding Osama. Special forces teams conducted raids across Afghanistan and Pakistan's border regions based on intelligence tips. The US government offered a $25 million reward for information leading to his capture, later increased to $50 million. But Osama remained elusive. Part of the problem was Pakistan itself. The country's leadership publicly supported America's war on terror, while elements within Pakistan's intelligence service, the ISI, maintained ties to Islamic militants. Pakistan needed militant groups as proxies in its perpetual Cold War with India. The ISI's support for militants was selective and calculating, but it meant Pakistan was never fully committed to finding Osama. Some analysts suspected high-level Pakistani officials knew Osama's location, but chose not to reveal it. Others believed the truth was more complex. Pakistan's government was fractured, with different factions pursuing different agendas. Perhaps some Pakistani officials knew, others didn't, and institutional dysfunction prevented coordinated action. Regardless, years passed without significant progress. Then, sometime around 2005-2006, Osama made a decision that would ultimately prove fatal. He settled down. Abbottabad is a pleasant, mid-sized city in northern Pakistan, named after a British colonial officer. It sits in a valley surrounded by hills, approximately 35 miles from Islamabad, Pakistan's capital. The city's main claim to fame was Kakul Military Academy, Pakistan's equivalent of West Point, located just outside town. Officers and military families were everywhere in Abbottabad. It was hardly the lawless frontier where one might expect the world's most wanted terrorist to hide. Perhaps that was exactly why Osama chose it. In 2005, A mysterious compound was completed in Abbottabad's Bilal town neighborhood. The construction had taken several years. Local residents noticed the unusual property taking shape, but paid it limited attention. Wealthy people often built elaborate homes with high security. The compound was extraordinary, though. Built on a 38,000 square foot lot, 8 times larger than surrounding properties, it was surrounded by concrete walls 12 to 18 feet high, topped with barbed wire. The walls were deliberately designed to be unwelcoming, with broken glass embedded in concrete in places. Inside were 2 main buildings. The larger 3-story structure had few windows, and those it had were positioned to prevent anyone from seeing in. The 3rd-floor terrace featured a 7-foot-high privacy screen, unusually tall, built apparently to shield someone exceptionally tall from observation. The compound had no telephone lines, no internet connection. Residents burned their trash rather than putting it out for collection, preventing any intelligence gathering from refuse. The compound's inhabitants were never seen socializing with neighbors. When anyone inside needed to venture out, they did so in vehicles with tinted windows. It was, in short, exactly the kind of place where a paranoid fugitive would hide, which is why, in retrospect, it's astonishing that it took years for anyone to realize what it was. Osama lived on the compound's 3rd floor with his youngest wife, Amal, a Yemeni woman he'd married in 2000 when she was just 17. Several of his adult sons lived in the compound as well, along with their families. In total, perhaps 24 people resided there. They were protected by a handful of loyal guards, including Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti, a Pakistani Kuwaiti courier who'd been with Osama since the Tora Bora escape. Daily life in the compound was monotonous and restricted. Osama rarely left the 3rd floor. He maintained no communication with the outside world except through trusted couriers. His days were spent praying, reading, watching news broadcasts recorded by his family and brought to him on USB drives, and occasionally recording video or audio messages that would be smuggled out and eventually released to the media. He was isolated, aging increasingly irrelevant to Al-Qaeda's day-to-day operations. Regional affiliates made their own decisions. The organization he'd founded was evolving beyond his direct control, yet his symbolic importance remained. He was still the face of global jihad, the man who'd struck America's homeland. This symbolic importance kept American intelligence services obsessed with finding him. The breakthrough came through patient, painstaking intelligence work. CIA analysts had been building detailed profiles of everyone known to be close to Osama. They tracked family members, old associates from the Afghan war, anyone who might maintain contact. One name that kept appearing was Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti, the courier who'd been at Tora Bora and was believed to still be with Osama. For years, they couldn't find him. Then, in 2007, they intercepted a phone call. Someone using a phone registered to al-Kuwaiti's family made a brief call. The CIA located the call's origin, Abbottabad. This alone wasn't conclusive. Perhaps al-Kuwaiti had settled in Abbottabad for innocent reasons, but it was worth investigating. Through 2009 and 2010, the CIA intensified surveillance of Abbottabad, trying to locate al-Kuwaiti specifically. Pakistani intelligence was deliberately not informed. The CIA had learned that leaks from Pakistani services often compromised operations. They found him. By mid-2010, CIA analysts had identified the mysterious compound in Bilal town and confirmed that al-Kuwaiti was living there. Satellite imagery showed the compound's unusual features. Human intelligence, agents on the ground, observed the compound's residents' strange behavior. The pieces were fitting together, but they still lacked proof that Osama was actually there. No one had ever seen him. The 3rd-floor terrace had that suspicious privacy screen, but perhaps it was just an eccentric resident who valued privacy. The CIA spent tens of millions establishing a safe house in Abbottabad from which agents could watch the compound. They used the most sophisticated surveillance technology available, thermal imaging that could detect heat signatures inside the compound, attempting to count residents and identify movement patterns. They couldn't get a clear look at the tall man on the third floor. He'd never left that level. When he did venture onto the terrace for exercise, pacing back and forth for hours, the privacy screen hid him. By early 2011, CIA analysts were convinced but couldn't prove it. They estimated 60–80% probability that Osama was in the compound. Not certainty, but enough to brief President Obama. The president faced an agonizing decision: launch a raid based on circumstantial evidence. The compound was in a Pakistani city, near a military academy. Any American military operation would violate Pakistani sovereignty. If they were wrong, if it wasn't Osama, the diplomatic fallout would be severe. If they were right, but he escaped or was killed without confirmation, the world might never know for certain. Obama ordered contingency planning. Military planners developed several options: a drone strike, ruled out because it would destroy evidence of who died; a bombing raid, same problem; or a helicopter assault with special forces who could confirm identity. On April 29, 2011, President Obama authorized Operation Neptune Spear, helicopter raid using SEAL Team 6, the Navy's most elite special operations unit. May 1, 2011, 3:30 p.m. Washington time, 1 a.m. May, Sirkand in Pakistan. President Obama sat in the White House Situation Room, surrounded by his national security team: Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, Defense Secretary Robert Gates, CIA Director Leon Panetta, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Admiral Mike Mullen. A video screen showed grainy footage transmitted from a drone circling above Abbottabad. In Afghanistan, 24 Navy SEALs boarded 2 modified Black Hawk helicopters. The helicopters had been altered to reduce noise and radar signature, stealth modifications similar to those used in advanced military aircraft. The SEALs wore night vision goggles, carried specialized weapons, and knew the compound's layout from extensive planning and rehearsals on a full-scale model built at a CIA facility. The flight from Afghanistan to Abbottabad took approximately 90 minutes, flying low through mountainous terrain to avoid Pakistani radar. If detected, Pakistani aircraft might scramble to intercept. The SEALs would have to fight their way out or die trying. At 12:30 a.m. Pakistan time, the helicopters descended on the compound. The first helicopter attempted to hover while SEALs fast roped down into the compound, but something went wrong. The helicopter's rotor wash, the downward air blast from the rotors, created unexpected aerodynamic conditions, possibly because the compound's high walls trapped hot air. The helicopter lost lift and clipped the compound wall, crashing inside the perimeter. In the Situation Room, hearts stopped. Had the mission just failed before it began? But the pilots had managed a controlled crash. The helicopter was destroyed, but the SEALs were unhurt. They immediately exited and began clearing the compound. The second helicopter landed successfully outside the compound walls. Those SEALs blew a hole through the wall with explosives and entered. The compound's residents were awake now. The helicopter crash had ensured that. On the first floor, SEALs encountered one of Osama's couriers. A brief gunfight ensued. The courier and his wife were killed. The SEALs moved through the first floor, then headed upstairs. Time was critical. Pakistani military forces would respond to reports of helicopters and explosions. The SEALs had perhaps 15–20 minutes before Pakistani aircraft arrived. On the second floor, they encountered one of Osama's adult sons, Khalid. He was shot and killed. Another courier, Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti, the man whose phone call had started this entire investigation, was also killed on this floor. Then the SEALs headed to the third floor. 2 SEALs ascended the narrow stairwell, weapons ready. At the top, they saw a tall, bearded man in the hallway, peering around a doorway. One SEAL, identified later as Matt Bissonette, though this remains disputed, fired. The tall man staggered backward into the bedroom. The SEALs followed. The man was on the floor. One of Osama's wives, Amal, rushed at the SEALs. She was shot in the leg but survived. The tall man was shot again, in the head, to ensure death. It was 12:39 a.m. From touchdown to kill shot, 9 minutes. The SEALs immediately began evidence collection. They photographed the body, took DNA samples, gathered computers, hard drives, notebooks, anything that might contain intelligence about Al-Qaeda's operations. One SEAL took a measuring tape and confirmed the body's height, 6 feet 4 inches, Osama's reported height. In the Situation Room, CIA Director Panetta received the message, Geronimo Iquia, enemy, killed in action. The SEALs couldn't confirm identity yet, but everything suggested they'd gotten their man. The compound sweep took about 20 minutes. The SEALs collected 5 computers, 10 hard drives, more than 100 storage devices, and numerous documents. One of Osama's wives confirmed his identity to the SEALs. They loaded the body into a bag and carried it to the functioning helicopter. The destroyed helicopter was booby-trapped with explosives to destroy its classified technology, then blown up. A backup helicopter arrived to extract the remaining SEALs. By 1:10 a.m., 40 minutes after arrival, the helicopters were airborne, heading back to Afghanistan. Pakistani military forces, confused and slow to respond, never intercepted them. In Afghanistan, more conclusive identity confirmation was conducted. DNA samples taken from the body were compared to samples from Osama's deceased relatives. The match was definitive. Osama bin Laden was dead. At 11:35 p.m., Washington time, 8:05 a.m., Pakistan time, President Obama addressed the nation. Tonight, I can report to the American people and to the world that the United States has conducted an operation that killed Osama bin Laden, the leader of Al-Qaeda. Within 24 hours, Osama's body had been flown to the aircraft carrier USS Carl Vinson in the North Arabian Sea. Islamic tradition requires burial within 24 hours. To prevent any grave from becoming a shrine, the decision had been made to bury him at sea. After religious rites performed according to Islamic practice, Osama's body, weighted with chains, was dropped into the ocean from the carrier's deck. The exact location remains classified. The architect of September 11th had met an inglorious end. Shot in his bedroom, his body dumped in the sea, his decade-long flight ending in violence and anonymity. Osama bin Laden's death didn't end Islamic terrorism. If anything, it marked a transition to something even more extreme. By 2011, Al-Qaeda was already being eclipsed by a more brutal organization. In 2004, a Jordanian extremist named Abu Musab al-Zarqawi had begun operations in Iraq, eventually pledging allegiance to Osama and becoming Al-Qaeda in Iraq. But Zarqawi's methods were so vicious: beheadings, attacks on Shiite civilians, indiscriminate violence, that even Al-Qaeda leadership found them excessive. After Zarqawi's death in 2006, his organization evolved, eventually becoming the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, ISIS or ISIL. By the early 2010s, civil war in Syria provided ISIS with opportunity. The group seized territory, proclaimed a caliphate, and implemented governance so brutal that Al-Qaeda publicly disavowed them. Under Osama's successor, Ayman al-Zawahiri, Al-Qaeda condemned ISIS's tactics. The irony was extraordinary. The organization responsible for 9/11 was now seen as too moderate by younger jihadists. ISIS's rise demonstrated that killing Osama hadn't eliminated the ideology he'd promoted. If anything, his martyrdom inspired new recruits. Between 2014 and 2017, ISIS controlled territory in Iraq and Syria the size of Great Britain, ruling over millions of people with medieval brutality. Actually, American-backed forces defeated ISIS's territorial control. The caliphate collapsed, but the ideology persists. As of the 2020s, jihadist groups remain active across the Middle East, Africa, and South Asia. The The Taliban returned to power in Afghanistan after America's 2021 withdrawal. Osama's personal legacy is complex and dark. He transformed from wealthy Saudi into one of history's most consequential terrorists. The 9/11 attacks directly killed nearly 3,000 people, but the consequences stretched far beyond. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, launched partly in response to 9/11, killed hundreds of thousands and cost trillions of dollars. The refugee crises that followed destabilized regions and tested Western societies. Security measures implemented after 9/11 fundamentally changed air travel, surveillance, and civil liberties across the Western world. The psychological impact may be most lasting. An entire generation grew up in the shadow of 9/11. The war on terror shaped 2 decades of global politics. The images of falling towers became permanently seared into collective memory. Yet for all this impact, Osama's actual ideology had limited appeal. His vision of a unified Islamic caliphate governed by rigid Sharia law attracted only a tiny minority of the world's nearly 2 billion Muslims. The vast majority rejected his violent extremism. Even in his death, polling across Muslim-majority nations showed more people celebrated than mourned. His death brought closure but not resolution. Al-Qaeda continues under new leadership, diminished but not destroyed. The wars he helped spark continue. The ideological currents he rode, resentment of Western power, rejection of secular governance, nostalgia for imagined Islamic golden ages persist. In the end, Osama bin Laden's story is one of radicalization, violence, and ultimate futility. He was born into extraordinary privilege, positioned to live comfortably and do good. Instead, he chose a path that led to thousands of deaths, including his own. His final years were spent hiding in a compound, isolated from the world, his influence waning, reduced to recording videos and watching news of events he no longer controlled. The man who'd declared war on the world's most powerful nation died in his pajamas, shot by anonymous soldiers in a midnight raid. It was perhaps fitting. For all his grandiose rhetoric about civilizational struggle, his end was mundane, a criminal killed, resisting arrest. The towers he destroyed have been replaced. The organization he founded has been eclipsed. The ideology he championed has been largely rejected. What remains is memory of the thousands who died, of the wars that followed, of a day when the world changed, and a warning that privilege, intelligence, and dedication, when wedded to extremism, can produce monsters.